The war's darkest hour. The galaxy was at war and things were looking bleak. The enemy, a powerful and ruthless alien coalition, had been winning battle after battle. They had pushed the Allied forces, a fragile group of different species, to the brink of destruction. Among these allies were humans, known for their resilience and bravery, but even they were struggling to hold on. The last stronghold of the Allies was a planet called Valoria. It was once a beautiful world, full of life, but now it was scarred by endless battles. The skies were dark with smoke, and the ground was littered with the remnants of destroyed ships and fallen soldiers. The Allied forces had gathered here for what seemed like one final stand. In the command center, the atmosphere was tense. The leaders of the various species sat around a large table, their faces grim. General Kyle, a seasoned human commander, stood at the head of the table. His uniform was worn, his face lined with the stress of endless warfare. He knew that if Valoria fell, the entire alliance would crumble. "Our defenses are holding for now," General Kyle said, his voice steady, but everyone could hear the worry in his tone. "But the enemy is preparing for a massive assault. They know this is our last stand." A tall alien with blue skin and multiple eyes, Commander Gzell, spoke up. "We cannot win this battle with the forces we have left. Our ships are damaged, our soldiers exhausted. We need reinforcements, but none are coming." The room fell silent. Everyone knew the truth. There were no reinforcements. The Allied forces were spread too thin across the galaxy. They were alone. General Kyle looked at the faces around the table. He saw fear, doubt, and despair, but he also saw determination. These leaders had fought too hard to give up now. "We still have one option," he said, breaking the silence. "The secret fleet." A murmur went through the room. The secret fleet was a rumor, a story told among the ranks. It was said that the humans had been building a powerful fleet in secret, a fleet that could turn the tide of the war. But no one knew if it really existed. "Does it even exist?" asked Captain Rhea, a young and fierce human officer. "We've heard whispers, but we've seen nothing." General Kale hesitated. He knew the truth, but revealing it now could be dangerous. The enemy had spies everywhere. But there was no other choice. "It exists," he said firmly, "but its location is a closely guarded secret. Even I don't know where it is. All I know is that when the time is right, it will reveal itself." The leaders exchanged glances. It was a slim hope, but it was better than nothing. "What do we do until then?" asked Commander XL. "We hold the line," General Kale replied. "We fight with everything we have. We make them pay for every inch of ground they take. We buy the fleet time to arrive." Outside, the battle raged on. The enemy was relentless, sending wave after wave of fighters and ground troops against the Allied defenses. The sky above Valoria was filled with the flashes of laser fire and the explosions of ships being torn apart. On the ground, soldiers fought in the trenches, their faces covered in dirt and sweat, their weapons nearly overheated from constant use. Private Lyra, a young human soldier, crouched in a trench, her heart pounding in her chest. She had joined the military to protect her home, but she had never imagined it would come to this. She fired her rifle at an approaching enemy, hitting it square in the chest. The alien fell, but more were coming. "They just kept coming! Keep firing!" shouted Sergeant Vec, her squad leader, a towering man with a voice that could cut through the noise of battle. "Don't let them breach the line!" Lyra nodded and kept shooting, but she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her stomach. How much longer could they hold out? How much longer until they were overrun? In the skies above, the Allied fleet was faring no better. Captain Rhea's ship was one of the few still flying, but it was barely holding together. "Shields at 20%, called out her engineer. "Divert all power to the weapons," Rhea ordered. "We're not going down without a fight." The ship shook as it took another hit, but Rhea kept her focus. She had to believe that the secret fleet would come. It was the only hope they had left. Back in the command center, General Kale watched the battle unfold on the holographic display. The lines were holding, but just barely. He could see the enemy forces massing for a final push. If they broke through, it would be the end. "Prepare for the final assault," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. He knew that this might be the last order he ever gave. As the enemy forces began their final approach, the sky above Valoria suddenly lit up with a bright light. General Kale looked up in shock as dozens of massive warships appeared out of nowhere. It was the secret fleet. The tide of the battle was about to change. A desperate last stand. The arrival of the secret fleet brought a surge of hope to the Allied forces, but they were still far from victory. The enemy, though surprised, was not defeated. They regrouped quickly, determined to crush the last resistance of the Allies and put an end to the war. General Kyle watched the holographic display in the command center, his eyes narrowing as he studied the enemy's movements. The enemy fleet was massive, with ships that dwarfed those of the Allies. The secret human fleet had evened the odds, but it was still an uphill battle. "They're preparing for another push," he said, his voice tense. "This is it. They're throwing everything they have at us." The other leaders in the room nodded grimly. They knew what was at stake. If they lost this battle, there would be no more strongholds, no more retreats. This was their last stand. "We must hold the line," said Commander Zell, his multiple eyes fixed on the display. "If we fall here, the entire galaxy will fall with us." General Kyle turned to Captain Rhea, who was now commanding one of the key ships in the secret fleet. "Rhea, your fleet is our best hope. You need to lead the charge." Captain Rhea, though young, had proven herself in countless battles. She nodded, her expression determined. "We'll hit them with everything we've got, sir." As the enemy fleet advanced, the Allied ships moved into position. The secret fleet, with its advanced weaponry and technology, took the lead. Rhea's ship, though battered from previous fights, was at the forefront, ready to engage the enemy head-on. In the trenches below, the ground forces braced for the inevitable assault. Private Lyra and her squad were among them, their faces tense as they prepared for what could be their final battle. "Stay focused, Lyra," Sergeant Vex said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We're not done yet." Lyra nodded, gripping her rifle tightly. The arrival of the secret fleet had given her a spark of hope, but she knew that this battle would not be easy. The enemy was relentless, and they would not stop until they had wiped out every last soldier. The enemy attack came like a storm. Massive ships fired beams of energy that cut through space like blades, and thousands of fighters swarmed around the Allied fleet, trying to overwhelm them with sheer numbers. On the ground, waves of enemy troops charged the trenches, their alien weapons blazing. Captain Rhea's ship shook violently as it was hit by enemy fire. "Shields at 10%! Her engineer shouted, panic in his voice. "Divert power from the engines to the shields!" Rhea ordered, her voice calm but firm. "We need to hold out a little longer." The ship's engines hummed as power was rerouted, and the shields flickered but held. Rhea's fingers danced over the controls, sending her ship into a sharp dive to avoid another blast. She knew that they couldn't keep this up forever. The enemy was too strong, too numerous. But giving up was not an option. "Not now. Fire all weapons!" Rhea commanded, and the ship's cannons roared to life, unleashing a barrage of energy that tore through the enemy ranks. Other ships in the secret fleet followed suit, focusing their fire on the largest enemy vessels, trying to break their formation. On the ground, the situation was just as dire. The enemy troops were closing in, and the Allied soldiers were fighting with everything they had. Private Lyra fired her rifle until it overheated, then switched to her sidearm. The air was thick with the sounds of battle, explosions, screams, and the whine of energy weapons. "We're getting overrun!" shouted one of the soldiers next to her, fear in his eyes. "Hold the line!" Sergeant Vex bellowed. "We can't let them break through," but the enemy kept coming. Lyra could see them advancing, their alien forms moving swiftly and without hesitation. She felt a pang of fear but pushed it aside. This was what she had trained for. This was why she had joined the fight. As the enemy drew closer, Lyra heard the unmistakable sound of Allied air support. She looked up to see a squadron of fighters swooping down, firing at the enemy from above. The sight filled her with a renewed sense of determination. They weren't alone. The secret fleet was holding the skies, and they were going to hold the ground. "Fall back to the second line," Sergeant Vex ordered, and the squad began to retreat in an organized manner, firing as they went. They moved back to a more fortified position, where they could continue the fight with better cover. Meanwhile, in the skies above, Captain Rhea's ship was locked in a deadly dance with one of the enemy's largest warships. The enemy vessel was heavily armored and bristling with weapons, but Rhea was determined to take it down. "Target their main reactor," Rhea ordered, her eyes fixed on the enemy ship's weak point. "If we can take that out, we'll cripple them." The ship's weapons fired a concentrated beam of energy at the reactor, but the enemy ship's shields held strong. "We're not getting through," the weapons officer called out. "Keep firing," Rhea shouted. "We'll break through eventually." The battle raged on, with both sides taking heavy losses, but slowly the tide began to turn. The secret fleet's advanced technology and the bravery of the Allied soldiers were starting to make a difference. The enemy was powerful, but they were not invincible. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Rhea's ship's beam pierced the enemy's shields and struck the reactor. The enemy ship shuddered, and then, with a blinding flash of light, it exploded, sending debris flying in all directions. A cheer went up from the Allied fleet. The enemy was still strong, but they had just lost one of their most powerful ships. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, victory seemed within reach. On the ground, Lyra and her squad held their position, fighting off the last of the enemy troops that had breached the trenches. As the dust settled, Lyra looked around at her comrades. They were exhausted, bloodied, but alive. "We did it," she whispered, hardly believing it. Sergeant Vec clapped her on the shoulder. "Don't get too comfortable. We've still got a war to win." Lyra nodded, but for the first time in days, she allowed herself a small smile. The battle had been won, but the war was not over. They would keep fighting, keep pushing back, until the enemy was defeated once and for all. The secret fleet arrives. The battle for Valoria was reaching its peak. The Allied forces were fighting with all they had, but the enemy's relentless assault was pushing them to their limits. In the midst of the chaos, a sense of anticipation hung in the air. The secret fleet had been promised, and now everyone was waiting for it to arrive. General Kale stood in the command center, his eyes glued to the holographic display that showed the battlefield. The Allied fleet was holding the line, but just barely. The enemy was throwing everything they had at them, trying to break through. "How much longer?" Kyle muttered under his breath, his fists clenched. Commander Zell, standing beside him, glanced at Kyle. "We can't hold them off much longer. If the secret fleet doesn't arrive soon, they'll arrive," Kale interrupted, his voice firm. "They have to." Meanwhile, Captain Rhea was in the thick of the fight. Her ship was leading the charge, but it was taking heavy damage. The enemy ships were relentless, surrounding them and firing from all sides. "Shields at 5%, her engineer called out, panic clear in his voice. "Keep firing," Rhea shouted back, refusing to give in. "We have to hold out." The ship shook violently as another blast hit them, and Rhea's hands tightened on the controls. She knew they couldn't take much more of this. But she also knew that giving up wasn't an option. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, a sudden flash of light filled the sky. Rhea looked up, her heart skipping a beat. Dozens of massive ships appeared out of nowhere, their sleek designs and powerful weapons unmistakable. The secret fleet had arrived. "By the stars," Rhea whispered, awe in her voice. "They're here." The Allied forces on the ground and in the air were momentarily stunned by the sight. The secret fleet was everything they had hoped for and more. The ships were larger and more advanced than anything the Allies had ever seen. They were equipped with weapons that could tear through enemy defenses like paper. General Kale's eyes widened as he watched the fleet take formation. He couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. The secret fleet had been humanity's greatest gamble, and now it was paying off. "Open a channel to the fleet," he ordered, his voice filled with newfound hope. A moment later, the face of Admiral Thorin appeared on the screen. He was an older man with a stern expression and eyes that spoke of countless battles fought. "General Kale," he said, his voice deep and commanding, "the secret fleet is here. Let's finish this." Kyle nodded. "We've been holding the line, but the enemy is strong. We need to break their formation and push them back. Leave that to us," Admiral Thorin replied. "We'll take the lead. Your forces can focus on mopping up the stragglers." As the transmission ended, Kale felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that they might actually win this battle. The secret fleet wasted no time. Admiral Thorin's ships moved into position, forming a protective barrier around the Allied fleet. Their advanced shields absorbed the enemy's attacks, and their weapons returned fire with devastating accuracy. The enemy, caught off guard by the sudden arrival of such a powerful force, began to falter. Captain Ria's ship was still in the thick of the fight, but now, with the secret fleet covering them, they had a chance to regroup. "We've got cover!" her weapons officer shouted, relief evident in his voice. "Good," Ria replied, her tone sharp. "Let's make it count. Target the nearest enemy cruiser and fire everything we've got." With renewed energy, Ria's ship unleashed a barrage of firepower. The enemy cruiser, already struggling to fend off attacks from the secret fleet, was hit hard. Its shields failed, and a moment later it exploded in a brilliant flash of light. On the ground, Private Lyra and her squad watched in amazement as the tide of the battle turned. The secret fleet's arrival had thrown the enemy into disarray. The once overwhelming waves of enemy troops were now retreating, their confidence shattered. Sergeant Vec grinned, his voice booming as he shouted to his squad. "Looks like the cavalry has arrived. Let's give them hell." Lyra felt a surge of adrenaline as she fired her rifle at the retreating enemy. The fear that had gripped her heart earlier was gone, replaced by a fierce determination. They had been on the brink of defeat, but now they had a chance to turn the tables. The secret fleet's presence was like a beacon of hope. The enemy, realizing they were no longer facing a weakened force, began to retreat. Their ships turned and fled, their ground troops scattering in all directions. The battle was far from over, but the momentum had shifted. In the command center, General Kale watched as the enemy forces started to pull back. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "We've got them on the run," he said, a hint of triumph in his voice. Commander Zell nodded, his eyes still on the display. "We need to press the advantage. If we can drive them out of this system, we'll have a chance to regroup," Kale agreed. "Signal all forces. We're launching a full counterattack. Let's finish this." As the Allied forces rallied and the secret fleet took the lead, the battle entered a new phase. The once dire situation had turned into an opportunity for victory. The enemy, though still dangerous, was no longer invincible. The Allied forces, with the secret fleet at their side, were determined to win. Captain Ria led the charge, her ship pushing forward alongside Admiral Thorin's flagship. The enemy ships, now in disarray, were no match for the combined might of the Allied fleet and the secret fleet. One by one, the enemy ships were destroyed or forced to retreat. On the ground, Lyra and her squad advanced, driving the enemy troops back and reclaiming lost territory. The battle was fierce, but now the Allies had the upper hand. The tide had turned, and victory was within reach. As the enemy forces continued to fall back, the Allies pushed forward with renewed strength. The secret fleet had arrived just in time, and now, with the battle turning in their favor, the Allied forces were ready to deliver the final blow: the enemy's fear. The battlefield was littered with the wreckage of destroyed ships, and the skies above Valoria were filled with the chaotic movements of the two fleets. But as the battle raged on, something changed. The once confident enemy forces began to falter, their coordination breaking down as fear crept into their ranks. On the bridge of her ship, Captain Ria could see the change in the enemy's behavior. Their attacks were becoming less organized, their ships retreating rather than pressing the attack. "They're losing their nerve," she said, her eyes narrowing as she studied the enemy movements on the holographic display. Admiral Thorin, commanding the secret fleet, had noticed it too. "They've never faced a force like this before," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "They thought they had us beaten, but now they're realizing just how wrong they were." General Kale, watching from the command center, could sense the enemy's fear as well. It was a subtle thing at first, a hesitation in their attacks, a slight delay in their responses, but it was growing stronger by the minute. The enemy, who had seemed so unstoppable just hours ago, was now on the defensive. "Their commanders are panicking," Commander Zell observed, his multiple eyes scanning the battlefield. "They're making mistakes," Kale nodded. "Fear is a powerful weapon. We need to exploit it." The Allied forces, bolstered by the arrival of the secret fleet, pressed their advantage. The enemy's fear was like a crack in their armor, and the Allies were determined to widen that crack until it broke. Captain Ria's ship was at the forefront of the assault, leading a squadron of ships that targeted the enemy's flagship. "Focus all fire on their command ship," Ria ordered, her voice filled with determination. "If we take it out, the rest of their fleet will fall apart." The Allied ships unleashed a devastating barrage of firepower, their weapons striking the enemy flagship with pinpoint accuracy. The enemy ship's shields flickered and failed, and explosions rocked its hull. Inside the enemy ship, chaos reigned. The once confident crew was now gripped by fear, their commander barking orders that went unheard in the panic. The enemy commander, a proud and ruthless leader, felt his confidence slipping away. He had never imagined that the Allies would fight back with such ferocity, and the arrival of the secret fleet had shattered his plans. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered to himself, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the command console. The fear in the enemy ranks was spreading like wildfire. On the ground, enemy troops who had been so eager to fight just hours ago were now hesitant, their movements unsure. Private Lyra, fighting alongside her squad, could see the fear in their eyes as they retreated, abandoning their positions under the relentless pressure of the Allied forces. "They're scared," Lyra said, her voice filled with both relief and determination. "They're actually scared of us." Sergeant Vec nodded, his expression grim but satisfied. "Fear makes them weak. We need to keep pushing, keep them on the run." As the Allied forces advanced, the enemy's fear became more and more apparent. Ships that had once been in tight formation were now scattered, their commanders unable to maintain control. Ground troops that had been so disciplined were now disorganized, their lines breaking as they fled from the advancing Allies. The secret fleet, with its superior firepower and advanced technology, was relentless. Admiral Thorin directed his ships with precision, targeting key enemy vessels and taking them out one by one. Each explosion, each destroyed ship, added to the growing panic in the enemy ranks. On the enemy flagship, the situation was dire. The ship's hull was riddled with holes, its engines struggling to keep it in the fight. The enemy commander, once so confident in victory, was now a man consumed by fear. He could see his fleet crumbling around him, his soldiers fleeing in terror. We need to retreat!" one of his officers shouted, his voice filled with panic. The commander hesitated. Retreat was unthinkable. It was a sign of weakness, of defeat. But as he looked around at the terrified faces of his crew, he realized that they were already defeated. The fear had taken hold, and there was no escaping it. "Order the retreat," he finally said, his voice hollow. "We've lost." As the order was given, the enemy fleet began to pull back, their ships turning and fleeing from the battlefield. The sight of the once mighty fleet in retreat was a powerful one, and it sent a surge of hope through the Allied forces. General Kale watched as the enemy ships fled, a small smile on his lips. "They're running," he said, the words filled with satisfaction. "We've broken them." But Admiral Thorin was not ready to let them go so easily. "We can't let them regroup," he said, his tone serious. "We need to press the attack and make sure they don't come back." The Allied forces, fueled by the enemy's fear and their own newfound confidence, pursued the retreating fleet. Captain Ria led the charge, her ship firing on the fleeing enemy vessels with relentless precision. On the ground, Private Lyra and her squad continued to push forward, driving the enemy troops back with every step. The fear in the enemy's eyes was clear, and it made them easy targets. Lyra felt a surge of triumph as she watched them flee. They had been on the brink of defeat, but now they were the ones chasing the enemy. The battle was not over, but the tide had turned. The enemy's fear had shattered their resolve, and now the Allies were the ones with the upper hand. As the last of the enemy ships disappeared into the void, the Allied forces knew that victory was within their grasp, but they also knew that the war was far from over. The enemy might be running now, but they would regroup. They would come back. And when they did, the Allies would be ready. The battle heats up. The sight of the enemy fleet retreating had brought a wave of relief to the Allied forces, but the battle was far from over. As the enemy ships pulled back, they regrouped at the edge of the system, preparing for a counterattack. The Allies, now emboldened by their success, knew they couldn't let their guard down. General Kale, still in the command center, watched the holographic display with a steely gaze. The enemy fleet was forming a new formation, and it was clear that they were planning something big. "They're not done yet," Kale said, his voice firm. "They're regrouping for a major push." Commander Zell nodded in agreement. "They've been beaten, but they're not defeated. We need to be ready for whatever they throw at us next." On the bridge of her ship, Captain Rhea was still catching her breath from the earlier fight. Her ship had taken damage, but it was still operational. "Status report," she ordered, her tone sharp. "Shields at 50%, the engineer replied. "We've got some hull damage, but nothing we can't handle." "Good," Rhea said, her eyes scanning the tactical display. "Prepare for another engagement. They're regrouping, and we need to be ready." The Allied forces began to reorganize, their ships and soldiers moving into defensive positions. The arrival of the secret fleet had shifted the balance, but the enemy was not going to give up easily. The air was thick with tension as both sides prepared for the next phase of the battle. The enemy fleet, now reformed and more determined than ever, launched their counterattack with a vengeance. Massive warships led the charge, their weapons blazing as they targeted the Allied fleet. Smaller fighters swarmed around, trying to overwhelm the defenders with sheer numbers. Captain Rhea's ship took the brunt of the initial assault. The enemy ships were relentless, their firepower intense. "Incoming missiles!" the tactical officer shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "Evasive maneuvers!" Rhea ordered, her hands flying over the controls. The ship swerved and twisted, trying to avoid the incoming projectiles. Explosions rocked the hull as a few missiles hit their target, but the ship's shields held strong. Below, on the surface of Valoria, the ground forces braced for the renewed assault. The enemy troops, reinvigorated by their fleet's regrouping, pushed forward with renewed aggression. Private Lyra and her squad were in the thick of it, their rifles blazing as they fought to hold their position. "We've got more enemy troops incoming," Sergeant Veck shouted, his voice strained. "They're pushing hard!" Lyra gritted her teeth, her eyes scanning the horizon for the enemy's advance. The battlefield was a chaotic mess of explosions and gunfire. "We can't let them break through!" she yelled, her voice carrying over the noise. "Hold the line." The enemy's renewed offensive was fierce. Their troops advanced in well-coordinated waves, their weapons firing in precise bursts. The Allied forces, despite their earlier success, were struggling to keep up. The enemy's numbers were overwhelming, and the Allied defenses were being pushed to their limits. Captain Rhea's ship, though battered, continued to fight. Her crew worked tirelessly, their focus unshakable. "We need to break their formation," Rhea commanded. "Target their command ships and take them out." The ship's weapons roared to life, unleashing a torrent of firepower. The enemy ships, caught in the crossfire, began to falter. But the enemy was not giving up. They responded with even greater force, their ships firing back with everything they had. On the ground, the situation was just as dire. The enemy troops were relentless, their assault pushing the Allied soldiers back. Private Lyra and her squad fought with everything they had, but the sheer number of enemy forces was beginning to take its toll. "We're getting overrun!" one of Lyra's comrades shouted, his voice filled with panic. "Fall back to the secondary position!" Sergeant Veck ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We need to regroup and hold them there." Lyra and her squad pulled back, moving to a more defensible position. They continued to fight, their rifles blazing as they held the line. The enemy was pushing hard, but the Allies were determined not to give up. The battle was fierce and unrelenting. The enemy's counterattack was intense, but the Allied forces were holding their ground. The secret fleet continued to provide crucial support, their advanced weapons and technology making a significant difference. Admiral Thorin, commanding from his flagship, was directing the fleet with precision. "We need to push them back," he said, his voice filled with determination. "Target their key ships and break their lines." The secret fleet responded with renewed vigor, their weapons firing with deadly accuracy. The enemy ships, though numerous, were no match for the advanced technology of the secret fleet. One by one, the enemy vessels were taken out, their formations breaking apart. On the ground, the tide of the battle began to turn. The enemy's advance was slowing, their troops starting to retreat. Private Lyra and her squad, though exhausted, continued to fight with unwavering resolve. The enemy's push was faltering, and the Allies were beginning to regain their footing. General Kyle watched the battlefield with a mixture of relief and determination. The enemy's counterattack had been fierce, but the Allies were holding their ground. "We need to keep up the pressure," he said. "We can't let them regroup again." As the battle continued to heat up, the Allied forces pressed their advantage. The enemy's formation was breaking, their troops retreating in disarray. The fight was far from over, but the Allies were determined to push through. The battle for Valoria was a fierce and brutal one, but with every push and counterattack, the Allies drew closer to victory. The enemy's defeat. The battle had raged for hours, with neither side willing to give an inch. But as the enemy forces began to falter, the tides of the conflict started to turn in favor of the Allies. The once fierce enemy fleet was now in disarray, their ships struggling to maintain cohesion as their forces fell back in chaos. General Kyle watched the holographic display in the command center, his eyes scanning the battlefield. The enemy's formation was breaking apart, their ships retreating in a haphazard manner. "We've got them on the ropes," he said, a note of triumph in his voice. "They're starting to fall apart." Commander Zell nodded, his many eyes reflecting the same sense of optimism. "Their lines are breaking. We need to press the attack and finish this." Captain Rhea, still leading her ship from the front, could see the change in the enemy's behavior. Their ships were retreating, their formations disorganized. "They're running!" she shouted to her crew. "Target their fleeing ships and take them out." The Allied ships, bolstered by the presence of the secret fleet, responded with renewed energy. Their weapons roared as they fired upon the retreating enemy vessels. The enemy ships, already battered and weakened, were easy targets. Explosions lit up the sky as one by one, the enemy ships were destroyed or forced to flee. On the ground, the situation was similar. The enemy troops, once so aggressive, were now retreating in disarray. Private Lyra and her squad, having held their position through the worst of the fighting, saw their enemies pulling back. "They're falling back!" Lyra shouted, her voice filled with relief. "Keep the pressure on!" Sergeant Vec, his expression grim but determined, gave the order. "Advance! Push them out of our territory!" The Allied soldiers surged forward, driving the enemy troops back. The enemy, already demoralized by the loss of their fleet and the fierce resistance on the ground, began to crumble. Their lines broke, and their soldiers fled in panic. The enemy commander, once so confident in his plans, was now a figure of defeat. On his flagship, he watched as his fleet was torn apart and his ground forces retreated. His face was etched with despair. "We've lost," he said, his voice hollow. "Order of full retreat." The order was given, and the enemy forces began their chaotic withdrawal. The ships that had once been a formidable threat were now fleeing in all directions, their once strong formations reduced to a scattered mess. The ground troops, too, were retreating in disarray, their disciplined ranks shattered. General Kale watched as the enemy's forces continued to retreat. The sight was both a relief and a victory. "They're broken," he said, a smile on his lips. "Let's finish this." Admiral Thorin, commanding the secret fleet, continued to direct his ships with precision. "We need to secure the area," he said, his voice steady. "Make sure they don't regroup and come back." The secret fleet responded with determination, their ships sweeping through the battlefield and targeting the fleeing enemy vessels. The enemy, their morale shattered and their forces in disarray, were no match for the well-coordinated Allied and secret fleets. One by one, the remaining enemy ships were destroyed or driven out of the system. On the ground, the Allied forces continued their advance. The enemy troops were now in full retreat, their organized resistance broken. Private Lyra and her squad, exhausted but triumphant, pushed forward, driving the enemy out of their positions. "We did it!" Lyra shouted, her voice filled with exhilaration. Sergeant Vec, though tired, couldn't help but smile. "Yes, we did. Let's make sure they don't come back." As the enemy forces fled the battlefield, the Allied forces began to regroup and secure their positions. The once fierce battle was now a scene of victory. The enemy's defeat was complete, their forces scattered, and their plans in ruins. General Kale, standing in the command center, looked out at the battlefield with a sense of accomplishment. "We've won," he said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "But we need to be ready. They'll regroup eventually, and we need to be prepared." Commander Zell nodded in agreement. Victory is ours for now. Let's make sure we're ready for whatever comes next. Captain Rhea, still on her ship, watched as the enemy ships disappeared into the void. The battle had been fierce, but the victory was sweet. "Well done, everyone," she said to her crew. "We've earned this." The Secret Fleet, having played a crucial role in the victory, began to return to their positions, their ships moving with the same precision that had marked their arrival. Admiral Thorin, observing the aftermath, felt a sense of pride. "We did what we came here to do," he said. "Let's make sure our allies are ready for the next fight." As the Allied forces celebrated their hard-fought victory, the battle for Valoria came to an end. The enemy's defeat was complete, their forces in full retreat. The Allies had won, but they knew that the war was far from over. There would be more battles to fight, more challenges to face. But for now, they could take pride in their hard-earned victory and prepare for whatever lay ahead. A new beginning. The battlefield was now silent, a stark contrast to the chaos that had filled the air just hours before. The enemy fleet had been driven out, their forces scattered and defeated. The Allies, though exhausted, stood victorious, their hard-fought battle coming to an end. General Kyle, standing in the command center, surveyed the aftermath of the conflict. The once dense cloud of smoke and debris was beginning to clear, revealing the full extent of the damage. His expression was a mix of relief and determination. "The battle is over," he said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "But our work is far from finished." Commander Zell, who had been monitoring the situation closely, nodded in agreement. "We've secured the immediate area, but we need to assess the full extent of the damage and begin rebuilding." Captain Rhea, now back on her ship, took a deep breath as she looked out at the still smoking remains of the battlefield. "We've won," she said to her crew. "But it's time to focus on the next steps. We need to help with the rebuilding and ensure that Valoria remains safe." The Allied forces began the process of securing and rebuilding. The once damaged ships were now being repaired, and the ground troops worked to clear debris and restore order. The mood among the Allies was one of cautious optimism. The victory was a significant one, but there was much work to be done. Private Lyra and her squad were among those tasked with aiding in the cleanup. Despite their exhaustion, they worked with determination, helping to clear the battlefield and assist the local population. "It's hard to believe it's finally over," Lyra said as she moved debris with her squad. Sergeant Vec, who was coordinating the efforts on the ground, nodded. "Yes, but we've got a lot of work ahead of us. The sooner we get things back to normal, the better." The people of Valoria, who had lived through the chaos of the battle, began to emerge from their shelters. They looked at the Allies with gratitude and hope. The arrival of the Secret Fleet and the efforts of the Allied forces had saved their world from disaster. As they began to rebuild their homes and lives, they were filled with a sense of renewed hope. The leadership of Valoria, deeply appreciative of the Allied forces' efforts, began to coordinate with them for the rebuilding process. High Counselor Ilara, a wise and respected leader, met with General Kale and Admiral Thorin to discuss the next steps. "We are grateful for your assistance," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. "But we need to plan for the future. How can we ensure that our world remains safe?" Admiral Thorin, ever the strategist, responded with a thoughtful nod. "We'll need to work together to rebuild and strengthen your defenses. We can also share our knowledge and technology to help protect against future threats." High Counselor Ilara nodded in agreement. "That would be very helpful. We want to ensure that our world is secure and that we are prepared for any future challenges." As the days passed, the rebuilding efforts continued. The once damaged areas of Valoria began to show signs of recovery. New structures were erected, and the once battered defenses were reinforced. The people of Valoria worked alongside the Allied forces, their spirits lifted by the promise of a brighter future. Captain Rhea, visiting one of the newly rebuilt areas, spoke with the local residents. "We're here to help you rebuild," she said, her voice filled with reassurance. "And we're committed to making sure you're safe and secure.